One issue, or rather set of issues that are very important to grapple with from a business ethics perspective when we're considering capitalism is the process that we call globalization, which has become identified as such within the last half century, but has been going on a global scale for quite a long time. And one way to formalize it is to talk about the integration of national economies into one single unit of a global economy. And if you think about it, it could also be regional economies. We could think of this in a number of different ways. But globalization means, as many people say, that the planet is getting smaller in that we're related to people on the other side of the world and we're tied in with them economically. Now, the capitalist system works in a global way because of this phenomenon. So one thing that happens is that capital, and by capital we mean the money that's spent in investment in order to achieve some return on investment, and then the profits from that are taken and reinvested yet again. Capital moves to areas of higher yield. So if one country is not a very good place for doing business, capital leaves that country and it goes to places where a more secure or a higher rate of return on investment can be not necessarily guaranteed, but at least gained. And it tends to be fairly unrestricted. So the process of globalization can be understood in one sense as massive movements of money and resources all around the world. It can be done sometimes on the basis of national entities engaging in development. You might think of China's massive investment in Africa and in their Belt and Road initiatives that will change the global economy for our lifetime. That's an example of a state agency intervening. But in many cases, it's corporations that are doing much of the work and financial capital as well. The hallmark tends to be free trade. And the idea behind free trade is that there should be less national protectionism. Tariffs should ideally go away. Things should be standardized between countries so that it facilitates trade as much as possible. And the idea is that you have less and less regulation intervening within the marketplace. So this relies on the notion of the invisible hand, the whole idea of laissez-faire capitalism where everything is going to turn out good for the consumers overall. When it works well, globalism does in fact develop local economies. It takes places that perhaps may be rural and devoted to agriculture, brings in industry, brings in other commercial enterprises, and has them develop the new economic base. Also bringing the possibility of learning new skills for laborers so that they can participate in this global economy. And it's supposed to produce worldwide prosperity. How is it going to do that? Well, by lowering costs and by providing a much larger array of services and goods, being able to get, for example, goods from China coming in shipping containers all the way over to here, then being transferred to all of our stores and being on the shelves or, getting to us through Amazon or however else we're going to acquire it, is supposed to allow us more choices and better and cheaper products overall. Now, that's the theory in general. Another key thing is that low-skill workers who are going to lose their jobs, as does happen in globalization, we'll look at the textile industry in just a moment, low-skill workers who lose their jobs will find higher-skilled jobs. So they're actually going to be moving up in the social hierarchy and in terms of their earning potential. So ideally, this is going to work out well for everyone. This is the rosy picture of globalization as we find people presenting it. Does it always work that way? Well, no. And perhaps globalization will work out good in the long run, but we're seeing many problems with it in the present. One is that countries that protect their workers and protect their citizens in a variety of different ways, and that regulate industry or regulate commerce will end up being penalized as a result. So, for example, if a country has a developed infrastructure that imposes costs on businesses, we should expect firms will relocate wherever costs are lower. Many developed countries dictate minimum wage rates, safety regulations, environmental protection. In a global free market, these could all be seen as unfair and costly restrictions on trade. So given the incentive for business to relocate to lower its overhead, governments, even first world governments, may be tempted to loosen these controls in order to remain competitive. Similar argument could be made about welfare programs in general, since they effectively impose taxes on businesses. So if we do have an extensive safety net providing people with, say, health care or unemployment insurance or worker retraining, businesses and capital may decide, well, we don't want to do our business there, we're going to go somewhere else. This, by the way, has happened within the United States as well. When we talk about the Midwest as being the Rust Belt, that's because a lot of those factories didn't just move overseas, they moved south to the American states where labor protections were very weak and employers could exploit workers, and when they built their plants, leaving the factories behind to rust or to be turned into other things. So that's one big issue, that if you're doing the right thing, you're being placed at a disadvantage in the global market. There's also what we could call a race to the bottom. If you're investing in, say, building a factory, you want to build it in a place where you have as much control as possible and you can get the labor as cheaply as possible. So you may, in fact, do business with nations that have a pretty unsavory record when it comes to, say, human rights. Another thing that ought to be considered is the development that's occurring really sustainable development, or are the businesses that are relocating in the global marketplace merely investing so as to extract the greatest amount of wealth possible and then leave and not leave anything else in place, to leave people high and dry, as we say. We've seen that in many instances, unfortunately. Another big problem is that capital is very mobile. You can transfer wealth all around the world, but workers are not. There are a number of different impediments to workers moving to where the jobs are. So, borders, for example, are open for trade, but often closed for aspirant immigrants. Depending on the skill level involved, this has meant that firms are more likely to relocate or outsource rather than go through difficulties associated with work permits. Rigorous border controls have resulted in a significant undocumented labor force in many developing nations who are ripe for exploitation, and a large labor force here in the United States that's undocumented. Workers may also not want to relocate. They may not want to leave the town that they grew up in or the region that they're from because they have attachments there, because workers are more than just numbers. Workers are living human beings who grow up and live and think of their lives within a social matrix. So that's a problem as well. Another big problem is the long supply chains that are extended when we have globalization taking place. And there's several problems with that. One might be that responsibility winds up being outsourced so much that nobody's actually responsible and workers are exploited, or national areas wind up being damaged in other ways. But the long supply chains are also problematic from an environmental perspective. It may be cheaper to get goods from China, but if that involves all of this use of petroleum products to get them over here, even if those costs are being displaced onto other people, as they are, we have an environmental impact that's resulting from that. Even within the nation itself, the fact that we're getting all of our fruits and vegetables from many, many states away when things are out of season, that should be seen as problematic as well. Not to say that we rule it out, but those costs need to be thought about. Industrial pollution is a major problem brought about by globalization because you can effectively outsource the polluting to other places. Great example of this is when your computers are being disassembled and all the parts are being stripped out of them, there's a lot of toxic chemicals that are being released. Much of that is happening in the third world. And it's being done by people who are not being given any sort of protection and who are living lives that wind up being damaged as a result. And that is, a function of globalization. It would cost quite a lot more to reprocess and recycle those computer components in a sustainable, environmentally conscious way. Another major problem that Gibson points out is that globalization ends up granting a great amount of power to some undemocratic institutions. That means institutions that don't reflect the wills of the people found out in democratic ways. We could talk about the United Nations for all of its flaws as still being a democratic institution, but we can't say that of organizations like the World Trade Organization or the International Monetary Fund. And yet they play a major role within the system of globalization. So that's a problematic aspect as well. It's not to say that we can, suddenly say, well, globalization has many problems, let's simply stop it. It doesn't work quite that way. But we want to be conscious of the moral issues that arise because of it. I mentioned, too, that we would talk about the textile industry, and that particularly fits in with long supply chains, industrial pollution, workers, and all of that sort of stuff. We think about it in an American context primarily because of the losses of our own textile industries, say, for example, in North Carolina, which has never really been replaced, to places like Mexico, and then eventually to Southeast Asia and to China. But really, we were the ones who benefited from outsourcing from England to the American South and Northeast as well. So this is a process that's been going on for quite a while. And, in its wake, what often ends up being left are all sorts of shuttered factories and warehouses, which then can be, transformed into something else, co-working spaces, lofts. But like somebody was saying in a great interview in North Carolina, he was one of the mayors of one of the towns, talking about how, the loss of the textile industry from the 70s to the 90s had just devastated the local economy, and that job retraining was, one of their top priorities. He said, we need to bring in some manufacturing. We need to have some sort of industry here because we can't all learn to become barbers and cut each other's hair. If you're going to have the higher skilled jobs, there has to be some sort of economic basis in the places that have lost jobs in order for that to happen. That doesn't seem to be what is going on with globalization, except in certain areas where there's already a pool of high skill workers. So that's a sort of overview of this massive process that's going to influence our lives for, actually not just our lives, but for the foreseeable future for humankind.